Thank you very much, Mr. President. Distinguished delegates, Indigenous peoples representatives, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor for me to address the Human Rights Council and present my annual thematic report. This year, my report focuses on Indigenous persons with disabilities and the specific challenges they face on their Indigenous status and disabilities. An estimated 1.3 billion people, or 16% of the world's populations, are persons with disabilities. While there is a lack of disaggregated global data on Indigenous persons with disabilities, the estimate is more than 54 million. The disproportionately high number of persons with disabilities among Indigenous peoples are driven by multiple factors, including environmental pollution and systematic poverty. These issues are compounded by historical and ongoing racial discrimination, which hinder their participation in society on an equal basis with others. The lack of disaggregated data and culturally appropriated disability support services leads to misdiagnosis in healthcare and inadequate care, perpetuating the cycle of disadvantage. In many states, there is a significant funding and infrastructure gap that continue to have an impact on access to healthcare services, education, adequate and accessible housing, employment, and economic opportunities for Indigenous persons with disabilities. Indigenous persons with disabilities are overrepresented among persons living in poverty and are rarely consulted in matters affecting them. They face greater risk of violence, systemic discrimination, ableism, and racism from states and other actors. Climate change also exacerbates existing difficulties for Indigenous persons with disabilities, in particular those in rural areas, leading to health issues and violations of human rights, including as a result of the loss of ecosystems and exposure to pollution from industrial operations. Indigenous women are even more likely to have disability than Indigenous men. The marginalization experienced by Indigenous women with disabilities is gravely compounded because they experience the intersection of gender discrimination, racial discrimination, and discrimination against persons with disabilities. They also face lack of access to sexual and reproductive health services or sexual and reproductive health services that inflict harm rather than improve health, such as subjecting Indigenous women, in particular those with disabilities, to forced sterilization. Girls with disabilities are far less likely to attend school than boys. Women with disabilities are far less likely to be employed than men with disabilities. And both girls and women with disabilities are far more likely to encounter both sexual and non-sexual violence. Indigenous persons with disabilities often experience a unique and compounded set of challenges that are deeply intertwined with their identity, culture, and historical context. Addressing their needs requires an understanding of the intersectionality of their identities and commitment to upholding their rights as both Indigenous peoples and persons with disabilities. This includes respecting their collective rights to self-determinations, lands, territories, and resources, consultation, and free, prior, and informed consent before adopting any legislation or policy that addresses their unique circumstances. The prevalence of racism, colonialism, and land dispossession and the resulting intergenerational trauma that affect Indigenous peoples, in addition to inequities in the underlying and social determinants of mental health, are factors that can lead to a higher rate of psychosocial disabilities among Indigenous peoples across the world. Indigenous peoples have been subject to attempted erasure of culture, forced eviction, forced sterilization, and forced assimilation. These persistent harms are a cross-generational psychological wounding that manifest as a greatly increased likelihood of mental health conditions and psychosocial disabilities. In contrast, a lack of understanding and respect for the indigenous worldview and psychosocial diversity and the imposition of a colonial biomedical understanding of mental health that informs laws, policies, and practice can lead to inappropriate diagnosis and the disproportionate use of coercive measures. The mental health treatment techniques used in Western psychology and psychiatry may not only be ineffective, but could also be harmful or traumatizing for indigenous peoples if intergenerational trauma is not recognized in their intake, assessment, and diagnostic processes. The misalignment between state diagnostic tools and indigenous peoples' perspective not only leads to culturally inappropriate classification, but also contribute to increased impairment rates among indigenous peoples by blocking access to accurate and culturally appropriated service and support. Conventional care systems have also historically been used and continue to be used to separate indigenous children with disability from their families, placing them in out-of-home care away from their parents and communities. Indigenous people must be able to decide for themselves the best support and care system for their children in accordance with their culture and their inherent right to self-determination over their internal affairs, in line with human rights standards, at all times keeping in mind the best interest of the child. It is paramount to adopt human right-based approach to support and care system and to adapt them to indigenous culture. Ensuring the right to consultation and free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous persons with disability is one of the most important principles that can protect the right to full and effective participation in decisions affecting them. Unfortunately, in many states, the requirement for free, prior, and informed consent and the meaningful participation of indigenous people does not take into account the barriers faced by indigenous persons with disabilities and does not include provisions for their inclusion and decision-making processes. Despite many challenges communicated to me, I was also encouraged to receive information with regard to good practices by the states and indigenous people to advance the right of indigenous persons with disabilities, which have been reflected in the report as well. I would like to reiterate that although the present report addresses the right of indigenous persons with disabilities, such rights cannot be understood or addressed comprehensively without taking into account the collective rights of indigenous peoples. Moving towards full equality involves, inter alia, promoting community-led initiative, ensuring the availability of culturally appropriate service and fully implementing indigenous people's rights, including the right to self-determination and land, territory, and resources. It is essential to respect the right of indigenous persons with disabilities to consultation and free, prior, and informed consent, including through their representative organization before adopting any legislation, policy, or project that may affect them. As indigenous persons with disabilities are disproportionately affected by the negative consequences of climate change and environmental pollution, it is necessary to adopt inclusive and accessible policies and consultation with them to mitigate this adverse effect. I would also like to reiterate that creating policies that are holistic and inclusive of indigenous people with disabilities is essential in fostering equality, justice, and true societal progress. Such policies recognize the unique intersectionality challenges faced by indigenous people with disabilities who often encounter compounded barriers due to their indigenous identity and their disability. Involving indigenous people with disability in policy development is not only a matter of justice, but also a crucial step towards building a society where everyone, regardless of background or any other status, has the opportunity to fully participate and succeed. I have provided several recommendations to resolve the challenges faced by indigenous persons with disabilities. I encourage state and other stakeholders to give due consideration to the implementation of these recommendations. Mr. Vice President, today I also present my report on the country visit to Colombia, which took place from the 5th to the 15th of March 2024. I would like to thank the government, indigenous people, civil society, and United Nations agencies in Colombia for their excellent cooperation and support. During my visit, while encouraged by some good practices, I identified several issues of concern. The Constitutional Court has declared the imminent risk of physical and cultural extermination of 71 of the 115 indigenous peoples in Colombia. 35 of these people have less than 200 inhabitants. However, there is still lack of effectiveness in the implementation of plans against the consequences of the armed conflict, against the advancement of the extractive industry, and racism and racial discrimination in accessing the public services. The armed conflict in indigenous territory has not ceased. Despite 2016 peace agreement, indigenous people do not consider living in post-conflict, but rather post-agreement. War usually has strong intensity in indigenous territories, including in sacred or protected places, with a disproportionate impact on women, children, and older adults. Despite the provision of the 1991 Constitution, the state has not yet adopted the necessary legislation to recognize indigenous territories as autonomous political territorial entities. The imposition of a state structure external to indigenous institutions has forced indigenous people to agree upon strange political ideas such as reservations, municipalities, and communities' action boards. This has contributed to the loss of culture, fragmentation, the weakening of their system of self-governance and ancestral authorities. In Colombia, the transition to a green economy is also becoming an adversary for the rights of indigenous peoples. From green fields to carbon credit, it is important to acknowledge that indigenous people are the traditional owners and custodians of the lands where most of those projects take place. Therefore, they should not be excluded from the design, implementation, and benefits of green transition projects. The imposition of megaprojects by transnational corporations without respecting territorial rights and without the consent of indigenous people has resulted in displacement, loss of culture, and environmental degradation. The failure to repair environmental damage seriously affects indigenous peoples since their territories are their sources of food, health, and spirituality. I urge the government of Colombia to put emphasis on the seriousness of the issues presented and to enact effective measures to address the dire situation of indigenous people in the country. Finally, I urge the government and all interlocutors to remain vigilant against the possible risk of reprisals against any indigenous peoples, person, or organizations. If this occurs, Colombia must repudiate such acts, support the individuals or groups concerned, and ensure fair investigation, punishment, and non-repetition. Mr. Vice President, Your Excellencies, brothers and sisters, this will be my last interactive dialogue as a Special Rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples. I wish to thank the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the University of Arizona for their most valuable support to this mandate. I will also thank Indigenous peoples, organizations, brothers and sisters across the world for their engagement with me as a Special Rapporteur, and even more for their determination in the fight for Indigenous peoples' rights. I have been proud and honored to serve as a Special Rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous peoples. I am very much committed to doing what I can do, continue supporting the Human Rights Council. As I said in my recent letter to the President, the role of the United Nations in a special procedure is perhaps more critical than ever in addressing many challenges that the world is facing. For the sake of Indigenous people and all rights holders everywhere, I can only wish success for those who contribute to the protection of human rights. Thank you very much.